The first and most crucial step in the journey from injustice to victory is recognizing and acknowledging that injustice exists. Without this awareness, there can be no movement, no progress, and no change. Too often, injustice is hidden behind systems that normalize oppression, behind excuses that justify inequality, and behind silence that enables wrongdoing. But history has shown us that ignoring injustice only allows it to grow stronger. Injustice manifests in different ways: political corruption, racial and gender discrimination, economic exploitation, social inequality, and human rights violations. It is found in the suppression of voices, the denial of opportunities, and the systemic barriers that prevent people from reaching their full potential. Whether it is a single individual being wronged or an entire community suffering under oppression, recognizing the presence of injustice is the first spark that ignites the fire of change. Throughout history, the most transformative movements began with people who refused to accept injustice as normal. The civil rights movement in the United States began because individuals recognized that segregation and racial discrimination were unjust. The fight against apartheid in South Africa started because people acknowledged that racial oppression was inhumane. Women's suffrage movements worldwide arose when society realized that denying women the right to vote was a fundamental injustice. Each of these movements was fueled by people who saw oppression for what it was and refused to turn a blind eye. However, recognizing injustice is not always easy. It requires courage to confront uncomfortable truths. It requires self-awareness to acknowledge when we, knowingly or unknowingly, contribute to systems that perpetuate inequality. It demands an open mind to listen to those whose experiences are different from our own. And most importantly, it requires a willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it is difficult or unpopular. Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at a crossroads, one that many before us have faced. It is the path from injustice to victory, from oppression to liberation, from despair to hope. History has shown us that injustice is not the end of the road. It is a challenge that fuels resilience, courage, and ultimate triumph. The power of recognition lies in its ability to awaken both individuals and societies. When people become aware of an injustice, they start questioning the structures that uphold it. Awareness leads to conversations, conversations lead to movements, and movements lead to change. Recognizing injustice is not just about seeing the problem, it is about understanding its impact, identifying its roots, and acknowledging the need for action. Injustice thrives in darkness, in ignorance, and in silence, but when we shine a light on it, when we name it, expose it, and refuse to ignore it, we take the first step toward justice. It is only when people recognize injustice that they can begin to resist it, to challenge it, and ultimately to overcome it. Resilience is the backbone of any journey from injustice to victory. It is the ability to keep moving forward despite the hardships, setbacks, and obstacles that arise. The road to justice is never smooth. It is filled with resistance, opposition, and, at times, overwhelming despair. But those who achieve victory are the ones who refuse to give up, no matter how difficult the fight becomes. History has shown us that every movement for justice has faced fierce resistance. Those who have challenged systems of oppression have been met with intimidation, threats, and even violence. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the struggle for gender equality, and the fight against colonial rule were not won overnight. They required generations of people who had the strength to endure suffering, withstand failure, and continue fighting even when victory seemed out of reach. Resilience does not mean ignoring pain or pretending that struggles do not exist. It means acknowledging the hardships, feeling the weight of oppression, and yet still finding the strength to push forward. It means standing up after every fall and refusing to be broken by adversity. Resilience is not just about physical endurance, it is about mental and emotional strength, about having the determination to keep going even when the world seems against you. One of the greatest examples of resilience is Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison for fighting against apartheid in South Africa. Many would have given up in the face of such prolonged suffering, but Mandela remained steadfast in his belief that justice would prevail. When he was finally released, he did not seek revenge or give in to hatred. Instead, he used his resilience to unite a divided nation and lead South Africa toward democracy. His story teaches us that resilience is not just about surviving injustice, it is about using our struggles as fuel to create meaningful change. Similarly, the story of Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban for advocating girls' education, is a testament to the power of resilience. She could have remained silent, afraid of further attacks, but instead, she chose to continue her fight on an even greater scale. Today, she is a global symbol of resistance against oppression, proving that resilience can turn personal suffering into a force for change. Resilience is not reserved for historical figures alone. It exists in the everyday people who continue to push forward despite hardship. It is in the single mother working multiple jobs to provide for her children, in the activist marching in the streets for a better future, in the student refusing to accept an unfair system, and in the whistleblower standing up against corruption. Every act of resilience, no matter how small, contributes to the larger fight for justice. The truth is, injustice will always try to break those who oppose it. It will attempt to silence voices, crush movements, and instill fear. But resilience is what ensures that the fight continues. It is what transforms pain into power, fear into courage, and defeat into a stepping stone toward victory. Without resilience, injustice wins, but with resilience, even the most powerful oppressors can be overcome. History is a powerful teacher. It holds the stories of those who came before us, those who fought against oppression, challenged injustice, and ultimately triumphed. When we look back at these stories, we find patterns that reveal important lessons. No injustice lasts forever, no oppressor remains unchallenged, and no struggle is in vain when people refuse to surrender. One of the most significant lessons history teaches us is that change is never immediate. Great movements for justice take time, and those fighting for them must be prepared for a long and difficult road. The American civil rights movement did not achieve equality overnight. It took decades of protests, legal battles, and sacrifices by countless individuals before the laws began to reflect the ideals of justice and equality. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus was not just a simple act of defiance, it was the spark that ignited a movement. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a world free from racial discrimination was not just a speech, it was a vision that fueled a revolution. Another lesson history provides is that justice is never handed out freely by those in power. Those who benefit from oppression will always resist change. They will try to suppress movements, silence voices, and use fear to maintain control. This was seen during the fight against apartheid in South Africa, where for decades activists were imprisoned, tortured, and even killed. But despite this, the people remained steadfast, and eventually, the system of racial segregation collapsed under the weight of resistance. The Indian independence movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, is another powerful example. For years, the British colonial rulers believed they were invincible, that their empire was too strong to be challenged. But Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance proved that even the mightiest of oppressors could be defeated without the use of violence. His leadership inspired millions to stand against colonial rule, showing that moral strength is more powerful than military force. History also teaches us that solidarity is crucial in the fight against injustice. No great movement has ever succeeded without unity. The women's suffrage movement, the anti apartheid struggle, the labor rights movements, all of these victories were made possible because people came together to fight for a common cause. Divisions among those seeking justice only serve to strengthen the oppressor. But when people unite, their collective power becomes unstoppable. A key lesson from history is that even in the darkest times, hope must never be lost. The Jewish people who survived the horrors of the Holocaust went on to rebuild their lives and honor the memory of those lost. Survivors of genocide, slavery, and war have turned their pain into activism, ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. Their resilience teaches us that no matter how terrible an injustice may be, there is always the possibility of rebuilding, healing, and triumphing over oppression. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is that history is not just about the past, it is a guide for the present and the future. When we study the victories of those who came before us, we gain wisdom, inspiration, and the motivation to continue fighting our own battles. The struggles we face today, whether against racial injustice, gender inequality, economic exploitation, or human rights violations, are not new. They are chapters in the same ongoing story of humanity's quest for justice. By learning from the past, we equip ourselves with the tools needed to build a better future. Throughout history, the greatest victories against injustice were not won by individuals acting alone, but by the power of collective strength. Unity has always been the foundation of successful movements, and it remains the most formidable force against oppression. When people come together, combining their voices, their actions, and their determination, they become an unstoppable force for change. One of the biggest tactics of oppression is division. Those who seek to maintain injustice understand that as long as people remain divided by race, class, gender, religion, or political beliefs, they are easier to control. They use fear, misinformation, and even violence to keep people fighting among themselves, preventing them from focusing on the true enemy, the systems that create inequality and suffering. But history has shown us time and again that when people overcome these divisions and unite for a common cause, they are capable of achieving what once seemed impossible. A powerful example of unity in action is the civil rights movement in the United States. Black and white activists stood together against racial segregation, marching side by side, knowing that their strength lay in their solidarity. They endured beatings, arrests, and threats, yet they remained united in their demand for justice. The famous March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, was not just a gathering of individuals, it was a demonstration of the collective power of a movement determined to bring about change. Similarly, the labor movements that fought for workers' rights succeeded because they refused to be divided by employers who sought to exploit them. Through strikes, protests, and collective bargaining, workers around the world have won better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to be treated with dignity. Their success was rooted in their unity. If one worker stood alone, they could be easily silenced. But when thousands stood together, their voices could not be ignored. The fight for women's rights is another testament to the power of collective strength. The suffragists who fought for the right to vote did not win because of a single leader, but because women across nations came together, refusing to accept their exclusion from political life. More recently, movements like Me Too have shown how unity can challenge systems that have protected abuses for generations. When individuals speak up alone, they are often dismissed or silenced. But when thousands, even millions, unite with a shared message, change becomes inevitable. Unity is not just about numbers, it is about standing together despite differences. The most powerful movements are those that recognize that true justice cannot be selective. The Let to Rights movement, the environmental justice movement, and the fight for indigenous rights have all demonstrated that solidarity across communities strengthens the impact of each individual cause. When people recognize that their struggles are interconnected, they build alliances that make them even stronger. But unity is not always easy. It requires overcoming personal biases, setting aside differences, and focusing on the larger goal. It demands that people listen to each other, respect each other's experiences, and work towards solutions that benefit everyone. It means understanding that justice for one group cannot come at the expense of another, but rather that true justice uplifts everyone. The greatest threats to injustice come when people refuse to be divided, when workers stand with the unemployed, when men support women's rights, when the privileged use their voice to amplify the struggles of the marginalized. This is when real change happens. No great revolution, no historic transformation, and no lasting victory has ever been achieved without the strength of collective action. The more people who unite in the fight against injustice, the sooner victory will be within reach. Recognizing injustice is important. Feeling anger and frustration about oppression is natural. But these emotions alone are not enough to create change. History has proven time and again that injustice persists when good people remain silent. Those who benefit from inequality rely on the inaction of others to maintain their control. They count on fear, complacency, and apathy to silence those who might challenge them. That is why taking action is not just an option, it is a necessity in the fight for justice. Action can take many forms. It does not always mean leading a protest or speaking on a public stage. It can mean educating oneself and others, signing petitions, voting for policies that support justice, or standing up for someone being treated unfairly. Action can be as simple as refusing to laugh at a racist joke or challenging a harmful stereotype when you hear it. What matters is that we do something. Every small act of resistance chips away at injustice, while silence allows it to grow stronger. The civil rights movement in the United States offers a powerful example of how action, not just words, leads to change. Rosa Parks did not simply express her opposition to segregation. She took action by refusing to give up her seat. This act of defiance ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, a mass movement that changed the course of history. Similarly, the students who participated in lunch counter sit-ins during the 1960s did not just complain about segregation, they actively resisted it by occupying whites-only spaces, forcing America to confront its own injustices. Their courage and willingness to act, despite threats and violence, played a crucial role in dismantling racist laws. Action also means holding those in power accountable. Too often, people believe that injustice is too deeply rooted to change, that their voices do not matter, or that someone else will step up and fight. This kind of thinking allows corrupt leaders, oppressive systems, and harmful policies to remain in place, but history proves otherwise. When people take action, whether through protest, legal battles, or political engagement, they can force even the most powerful institutions to change. Women did not gain the right to vote because governments willingly granted it to them. They won it because they fought for it, suffered for it, and refused to be ignored. Silence, on the other hand, is complicity. When we see discrimination, abuse, or corruption and do nothing, we are allowing it to continue. Many of the world's greatest tragedies were made possible because too many people chose to look away. The Holocaust was not just the result of Hitler's actions, it was also the result of millions of ordinary people staying silent while their neighbors were persecuted. Slavery in the United States persisted for centuries not just because of the enslavers, but because many people chose to ignore its horrors rather than fight against it. Even today, Social injustices, whether in the form of racial discrimination, gender inequality, or economic exploitation, are allowed to thrive because too many people believe it is not their responsibility to intervene. However, taking action does not always mean engaging in grand, heroic gestures. It starts with individual choices, speaking up when we witness unfairness, supporting those who are struggling, and using whatever platforms we have to challenge injustice. Whether it is a journalist exposing corruption, a student organizing a protest, or an ordinary citizen voting for a fairer society, every action matters. Small acts of courage inspire others to do the same, creating a ripple effect that can lead to large-scale transformation. The most dangerous lie we can believe is that our actions do not make a difference. Every movement that has ever changed the world began with people who decided that inaction was no longer an option. Justice is not achieved by waiting for the right moment or hoping that someone else will take the lead. It is won by those who are willing to stand up, speak out, and take action, even when it is difficult, even when it is uncomfortable, and even when they are afraid. Struggle is often seen as something to be avoided, something painful, exhausting, and even discouraging. But history and experience have shown us that struggle is not just an obstacle, it is a force that transforms individuals, societies, and even entire generations. Every great victory over injustice has been shaped by struggle, and those who emerge from it are stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Struggle is not the end of the journey, it is the process through which real change is forged. Throughout history, those who have fought for justice have had to endure unimaginable hardships. Oppressive systems do not simply collapse when confronted, they resist, they fight back, and they inflict suffering on those who challenge them. The journey from slavery to freedom, from colonial rule to independence, from segregation to equality, and from oppression to liberation has always been marked by pain, sacrifice, and endurance. But it is within this very struggle that transformation occurs. Consider the abolitionist movement that fought to end slavery. Enslaved people who dared to escape or resist were met with brutal punishments, but their struggle laid the foundation for the eventual dismantling of the system. Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and risked her life repeatedly to lead others to freedom, transformed her suffering into a mission that changed the lives of countless people. Frederick Douglass, who was born into bondage, endured great hardship, but used his experience to become one of the most powerful voices for justice in American history. Their struggles did not destroy them, they strengthened them and made them agents of change. The same can be seen in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years because he refused to accept a system that treated black South Africans as second-class citizens. Many would have broken under the weight of such an ordeal. But Mandela emerged from prison not with bitterness, but with a vision of reconciliation and a determination to build a better nation. His struggle transformed not only him but also an entire country. Struggle is also deeply personal. Many individuals who have faced adversity, whether discrimination, poverty, war, or personal loss, have used their struggles to fuel their purpose. Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban for advocating girls' education, could have chosen to remain silent. Instead, she turned her pain into power, becoming a global symbol for education rights. The same can be said for countless activists, survivors, and leaders who have turned their hardships into motivation to make the world a better place. One of the greatest lessons struggle teaches us is that it reveals who we truly are. It pushes us to our limits, forcing us to confront our fears, weaknesses, and doubts. It tests our commitment to justice, making us question whether we have the strength to keep going. And yet, those who endure struggle emerge transformed, more determined, more courageous, and more capable of leading change. Struggle also creates unity. When people go through hardship together, they form bonds that strengthen their movements. The labor rights struggles of the early 20th century were filled with strikes, arrests, and violent crackdowns. But workers, despite their suffering, stood together, building a movement that eventually won fair wages, reasonable working hours, and safer conditions. The civil rights movement in the US was met with violent opposition, but the struggle united people across racial and social lines, strengthening their resolve and leading to landmark victories in justice and equality. Injustice does not disappear without resistance, and resistance always comes with struggle. Those who seek to oppress others will always try to break the spirits of those who challenge them. They will try to make the struggle so difficult that people give up. But history shows that those who persist to embrace struggle not as a curse, but as a path to transformation are the ones who ultimately change the world. Struggle is not easy, but it is necessary. It is through the fire of hardship that movements are strengthened, that individuals discover their true potential, and that societies evolve toward justice. The pain of struggle is temporary, but the change it creates is lasting. Hope is not just a feeling, it is a force. It is the belief that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. It is the unwavering conviction that justice will prevail, no matter how long it takes. Without hope, movements collapse, voices fall silent, and injustice remains unchallenged. But with hope, people find the strength to continue fighting, even when the odds are against them. Hope is the bridge between struggle and victory, and it is the guiding light that keeps movements alive. Hope is what fuels the greatest leaders and activists. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of his dream, he was not describing a reality that already existed. He was painting a vision of the future that could be achieved. His words resonated because they carried hope, not just for Black Americans fighting segregation, but for all people seeking justice. He knew that racism and oppression were deeply embedded in society, but he also knew that change was possible. That hope gave people the strength to march, to protest, and to endure imprisonment, knowing that they were moving towards something greater. Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in prison for resisting apartheid, held on to hope when many others would have given up. He once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." That statement is a testament to the power of hope. When oppression is at its worst, when injustice seems unbeatable, when everything appears hopeless, history reminds us that change is always within reach. The end of apartheid in South Africa was not just a political shift, it was a triumph of hope over despair, of vision over fear. Hope does not mean ignoring reality or pretending that struggle does not exist. It means seeing injustice clearly and still believing that it can be overcome. It is what allows people to endure pain, loss, and resistance without giving in to despair. The Holocaust survivors who rebuilt their lives after unimaginable suffering did so because they held on to hope. The families of victims of police brutality continue to demand justice because they believe that one day the system will change. The young activists fighting for climate action are driven by the hope that their efforts will lead to a more sustainable future. Hope is the reason why those who have been knocked down countless times still get back up and keep pushing forward. Hope must also be paired with vision. It is not enough to wish for a better world, we must be able to see what that world looks like. Every major movement for justice has been guided by a vision. The abolitionists who fought against slavery did not just fight against an unjust system, they envisioned a world where all people were free. The suffragettes who fought for women's rights imagined a world where women had the same political power as men. The left activists who fought for marriage equality did so because they could see a future where love was not restricted by law. Vision gives hope a direction. It turns dreams into plans and plans into action. But hope is not just for leaders, it belongs to everyone who refuses to accept injustice as permanent. It belongs to the student who dreams of a world without discrimination, the worker who believes in fair wages, the protester who marches for a cause, and the writer who uses their words to inspire change. Every person who stands up against oppression, no matter how small their action may seem, is holding on to hope. And when enough people share the same hope, it becomes a movement. Hope and vision must be protected, especially in times of crisis. There will always be forces that try to extinguish hope, governments that silence dissent, systems that maintain inequality, and those who benefit from oppression. They will try to convince people that change is impossible, that resistance is pointless, and that the world will always belong to the powerful. But history has shown that those who hold on to hope, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, are the ones who ultimately create change. Hope is not passive, it is active. It requires courage to believe in something greater than what currently exists. It demands persistence because change rarely comes quickly. It requires imagination because creating a better world means envisioning what does not yet exist. And most importantly, it requires collective belief because when people unite under a shared vision of justice, hope becomes unstoppable. The journey from injustice to victory is never easy. It is filled with struggle, sacrifice, and moments of doubt. But history has proven time and again that those who refuse to give up, those who stand together, take action, and hold on to hope are the ones who shape the future. No matter how powerful oppression may seem, no matter how impossible change may feel, justice has always prevailed when people have had the courage to fight for it. We are not just witnesses to history, we are its authors. The choices we make today, whether to remain silent or to speak out, whether to accept injustice or to challenge it, will determine the kind of world we leave behind for future generations. Victory does not come to those who wait for it. It comes to those who rise, resist, and refuse to accept a world built on inequality and suffering. So let us commit ourselves to the fight for justice. Let us stand together, unshaken by fear, unbroken by struggle, and unstoppable in our vision. Because no injustice is permanent, no battle is unwinnable, and no force is stronger than the united will of people determined to create a better world. Victory is not just possible, it is inevitable. And it begins with us.